What is this?
He was like, oh, it's iRobot. He was reading a book. Yeah. And then when he draws something, when he draws a picture.
Okay. So, we're going to do okay, so we're going to do exactly what we did for cardiology with pulmonology. But before we go, I want to make sure I clarify something because I talked to a few of you and I realized that you guys need to understand something. There are normal heart sounds. So if you listen to yourself, you hear heart sounds. Everybody carry one, right? Those normal heart sounds, they result from closure of the heart valves. That's normal. Murmurs are abnormal heart sounds. They result from turbulence. That mean? Okay. So, the noise that comes from turbulent flow makes noise, period. Whenever blood is flowing turbulently, it's noisy. That noise in the blood vessels, in the arterioles, in the arteries, is called bruit. That same noise in the heart is called a murmur. Noise that comes from turbulent blood flow is called bruit in the artery, is called murmur in the heart. Okay. So when I tell you that a valvular abnormality can affect the heart sound, yes, I mean it will affect the quality of the normal heart sound. And it will also give you an abnormal heart sound. So S1 can be loud, and there will still be a diastolic murmur. Right? They're two separate conditions. Right? We'll talk more about it next Monday. So let's talk about physiology. Respiratory system. Oh, please. Does it mean I have to stand here? You need to change the battery of this thing. What is it doing? Okay, so respiratory tract. Remember, please, don't waste your time for 3 hours only to go study what we just talked about. I need you to get this now. All of it. You can review later. If you don't understand it now, you will not get it later. These slides are not easy to read. They only make sense with what I say. If you don't listen to me and make good notes, don't write everything I say. Much of what I say is rubbish. I say very few things that are important. Just make sure you understand the slides and the things on the slides. Make note on the slide under them. Make sure you understand it. That is the important thing. Okay? Alright. So the respiratory system, respiratory tract is divided into two. There is the upper and there is the lower. And the upper is consists of nasal cavity, pharynx, and the larynx, and then the lower is trachea, primary bronchi, and the lungs. So you see the junction is the larynx, right? They are not for fancy. They are really there for specific things, right? So nasal cavity. Why do we need a nasal cavity? Well, you need a nasal cavity because there is hair in the nasal cavity. Even though we shave it now, sometimes, or even let me leave the house. Say, no, I need to shave that thing out. Leave my nose alone. Right? But that hair is put there for a reason. It's so it can filter the air and filter dust out of the air. So the purpose for the nasal hairs is to filter out particulate matter from the air that you're breathing in. Okay, that's the purpose. And the nasal mucosa is there to heat and humidify the air. See, because when the air is flowing through the nasal mucosa, it is exposed to body temperature. Because the nasal mucosa is heavily vascularized, right? So blood flow to it is higher. So it's at the body temperature. So when the air comes in, if you go out in some very cold places like Alaska, the air, it's because of the temperature difference, right? So the purpose of the mucosa is to humidify and warm up the air. If that doesn't happen, what happens is the rest of the airway gets dried. And that's why you notice in this kind of weather, sometimes people will come, they'll tell you cough up blood. It's not everybody that is coughing up blood that has TB. Sometimes you can cough up blood just because the airway is dry. Okay. And they have the paranasal sinuses. What do they do? What happens when you have a cold? Your voice sounds muffled, right? Why do you think that happens? Because your sinuses are now filled with gunk, right? They're not free air cavities. The purpose of the paranasal sinuses is they act as echo chambers, right? So they increase the volume of the sound that your voice box makes, right? So they act as echo chambers. You don't need, everything I'm telling you is already written here. Write it down when it is not explicit on the slide and listen more. Good. Now the pharynx. Now the pharynx is a common chamber. It is divisible into the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx, and that is very simple. That means the nasopharynx is the part of the pharynx that is continuous. Well, it is not. The pharynx is not anatomically divisible into nasal, laryngeal, and oropharynx. It's not. The pharynx is a common space. But if you look at it in a drawing, you can imagine an imaginary line or imaginary portion of the pharynx that is continuous with the nose, right? So nasopharynx will be the middle portion that is continuous with the nose, right? The oropharynx will be the part of the pharynx that is continuous with the esophagus, which is in the back, and the part of the pharynx that is continuous with the larynx is the laryngopharynx. Okay, so just take that common chamber and imaginary lines, and what it is continuous with is what is called nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. You got that? Okay. Why is the pharynx important? Because you talk and you swallow by the same mechanism. You can't do both. You cannot talk and eat safely at the same time. That is why you notice that when people are short of breath, they don't want to eat. Because for every swallow, they have to stop breathing. And if they're short of breath, they don't eat. That's why COPD patients are rarely obese. Okay? Now, why is that? So the pharynx is there to coordinate breathing and swallowing. The pharynx is also there to make sure that you have pressure equalization in the middle ear, because the middle ear actually opens into the back of the pharynx. That's why you can blow your ears by pinching your nose, right, and breathing hard against it. Once you do that, what you're actually doing is you're building pressure in the pharynx, and that pressure is getting transmitted through the opening in the middle there, right? That goes in the back there. So that's important for you to know. And exactly what does it do when I say it coordinates? We'll talk about that. Well, you should talk about that in GI. But basically what it does is all the swallowing, let me save my time. Because I think who does this? Lindsay will talk to you about that. So let's go to larynx. Larynx is your voice box. It's what the one of Adam's apple, right? Anyone has Adam's apple? Yeah. Good. All right. Good. So why you want to have Eve's apple? So it's your voice. It's where your voice comes from, and the larynx has a little window, right? Called the uppermost portion of the larynx is called the glottis, right? And it has a little extension called the epiglottis. The purpose of the epiglottis is to shut up the airway when you're swallowing. So what happens is you're swallowing, and then when you're ready to, you're chewing, when you're ready to swallow, reflexly what you do is you gather the food and you put the food on the tongue, right? So imagine me as your tongue. So you put the food right in the back of the tongue, and then when you swallow, you do that. So the tongue is like playing a basketball, launches the basketball into the esophagus. And so that you don't miss your way into the airway, the epiglottis closes the glottis. That is why you choke when you talk and eat at the same time. Because in order for you to talk, your glottis must be open. If you talk when you're eating, that means you're leaving your glottis open, and that food can go that way. And kids have been known to die. That is why you notice that in some cultures, the Eastern cultures and many African cultures, you spank your kid when they're talking and eating. You can call the cops. If you don't do that, you end up calling 911. And you notice, especially the Chinese, they don't talk when they eat. Well, you don't see Chinese in Chinese restaurants, but many times. But when I hang out with my Asian friends and we're eating, you go visit them and they invite you to dinner, it's like everybody's fighting. They're so quiet. But when my people are eating, that's when they allow them. So, that is what that is. Now, the lower respiratory tract, of course, begins with the trachea, it divides into the bronchi. All of this in the lower respiratory tract, they are just for cleaning and conditioning. Cleaning because you still have respiratory mucosa, right? That traps dirt. And along that mucosa, there are these projections called cilia. They beat backwards. So you have a layer of mucus, right? You have a layer of mucus. So let's assume that this is just a section of the airway. You have a layer of mucus. This is mucus, right? Good. And then you have this cilia. So these cilia, they are swimming within that mucus backwards. The idea is to trap any particulate matter that escaped from the nasal hair and sweep it toward the glottis. And when it gets there, you copy it. Okay? So that is the purpose of the cilia. You have this backward beating cilia. You have goblet cells. The goblet cells are the ones that make the mucus. And that is why if you look, the pharmaceutical companies, they like to make medications that block mucus production, dry mucus. When we get to down the road, we'll talk more about those. The lungs are gaseous exchange chambers. That is where the gas exchange takes place. Okay, it's at the lung level that oxygen is taken up and carbon dioxide is dumped. Okay, we'll talk more about that. Good. Everybody's okay? Excellent. What is wrong with this thing? See why I don't like this room? Okay, so let's talk about the thoracic cavity. Because you know why you really need to understand the thoracic cavity? Because the thoracic cavity is really responsible for the pressure changes that expand and collapse the lungs. The lungs do not have muscles. The lungs are not active. The lungs are passive structures of the respiratory system. They only respond to pressure changes that are created within the thoracic cavity. Remember that. So how is the thoracic cavity able to create this kind of pressure change that we're talking about? So I have this cartoon here to show you the lungs. You know, like this you've seen before, you know everything here. There is nothing here. The most important information on this slide is the fact that the lungs are passive and respond only to pressure changes in the thoracic cavity. And the next most important information is to remember that just like the heart, the lung is enveloped in a covering called the pleura that has the parietal pleura and the visceral pleura, just like you have in the heart, and both of them are separated by pleural fluid. There is a normal amount of pleural fluid. Okay, the pleural space is not empty. Okay, good. And what do you think? What is the purpose of that? Thank you. Exactly the same thing everywhere else. Oh man.
What if you flip the
like you like turn it around?
Yeah.
Well, if that will work, this will work. Oh yeah. Okay. Why does it work like that? Because the wall reflected the thing back. All right, so all those structures you see, I'm not going to waste your time. You just had 3 hours with the radiologist. Right? So I hope that all of this is nothing in, right? Right. You just need to know that yes, there is. You can actually see the heart, and you can actually see the bronchi and the trachea, and you can see the bronchi on an X-ray. You don't see the larynx on an X-ray. Okay? Good. And that you have these costophrenic angles, very important. Whenever you have excess fluid in the pleural space, the first cavity that gets obliterated on chest X-ray is the costophrenic angle. Okay? I'm sure the guy, you told me about this, right? Okay. So this is just giving you a little bit more information on how the pleura really is. You see, the color scheme back here is telling you the different description of the pleura. The one that is directly on the lungs is the visceral pleura, right? The one that is on the inside of the thorax is the parietal pleura. The one that is in the, exposed to the ribs, costal pleura. The one that is above the diaphragm, diaphragmatic pleura. The one that is covering the heart, mediastinal pleura. What is all that? Just know it. The most important thing is that you know that the pleura surrounds the lungs and there is a space between it, right? And there is a small amount of fluid between the visceral and parietal pleura that create the surface tension needed to keep the lungs tethered to the chest wall and its respiratory movement. I'll explain that. You've done, when you do physical diagnosis, have you been with Dr. Ataza? Okay. You guys made twins and you took those two, what do they call? Those two slides thing? The glass slides, right? When you dip them in water and you stick them together, how easy do they separate? They are very difficult to separate. Right, exactly. So you see that is exactly what happens. The visceral pleura and the parietal pleura with the small amount of pleural fluid connect the lungs to the chest wall by that same force that connects the two slides together. It's called surface tension. Okay. That is the reason if somebody gets stabbed in the chest, the lungs collapses. Okay, because you breach thorax. It's no longer a closed space. The pressure becomes positive and it collapses the lung. The lungs have no muscle, remember. Okay. You understand that? Mm-hmm. So you know now that the pleura, the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura, under normal circumstances, they don't really have a space, a physical space that you can see. A thin film of fluid is there, but it's not a space because the two pleura are tight together. But when there is disease like pleuritis, and there is pleural effusion, you form excess fluid that now separates them. And that now becomes visible on X-ray. That is why if you look at that X-ray I showed you, you couldn't tell visceral from parietal pleura. You don't see that they're together, just like those two slides are together. And it is the fluid in between them that keep them stuck together. And that is the reason whenever the chest wall expands, it drags the lung with it. Whenever it collapses, it moves the lungs with it. You understand what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So the lungs are passive. The only reason they move in respiration is because they are covered by two layers of pleura that are attached to it and the chest wall on the inside. Okay? Good. So don't waste your time about this problem. It's for semantic. That is nothing. This is the most important thing. Right? Okay. So how does the thoracic cavity actually work? How does it increase? How does it increase this volume and expands the lungs and all that? You know, the anatomy of the rib, of the thoracic cavity is important. Let's go through some of the changes. So, let's talk about inspiration. During inspiration, the inspiratory muscles, primarily the diaphragm and the intercostals, right? These are the primary respiratory muscles. When the diaphragm descends, it becomes flat instead of being down, right? So this is not the way normal diaphragm looks. The normal diaphragm looks like this. When you inspire, it looks like this. Okay? So it descends. When it descends, that means it's increasing the volume of the body. Right? So that is very easy to understand. Then the rib cage, they are moved up by the intercostals. So you see, when the rib cage are moved from like this to like this, you create volume, right? And that same movement moves the sternum forward, right? So those movements is what we call the bucket handle movement, right, of the rib, and the pump handle movement of the sternum, right? So I can ask you which of the following movement is responsible for the increase in thoracic volume during inspiration? Bucket handle, pump handle, elevator handle, or spring handle, something like that. So just pay attention to that. So the thoracic volume increases. Whenever the thoracic volume increases, what happens to, what did Boyle say, Bradley, about volume and pressure?
Thoracic.
No Boyle's law? You did the chemistry?
What was the question?
Boyle's law. You know Boyle's law?
Boyle's law, heard of it,
So what does it say? You don't remember? You're not a boy. Boyle's law. Boyle's law states that when pressure increases, when volume increases, pressure falls. Right? And when volume decreases, pressure rises. That's what that is. So according to Boyle's law, because the volume of the thorax is increasing, you expect the pressure to fall. Right? And whenever the pressure falls below what the pressure is outside of the lungs, air will rush into the lungs. Because air follows pressure, water follows the path of least resistance. That's the way it works in life. So when air rushes into the lungs get expanded, and intrapulmonary pressure drops. Air flows into the lungs down the pressure gradient until intrapulmonary pressure is zero. That means the pressure within the thorax and outside of the thorax are now equal. The airflow stops. Then the lungs stop expanding. And then at that point, everything is maximally stretched out and they just collapse on themselves. Right? And that's what we call expiration. Okay? So expiration muscles relax, the diaphragm rises, the ribcage descends, the sternum moves back, thoracic volume decreases. When the thoracic volume decreases, what happens to pressure? It increases. What happens? Air comes out. Okay? And the cycle repeats. Simple, right?
Yes.
Good. So, these are your respiratory muscles. They are primary. I know when you talk to you about this, right? Primary respiratory muscle is really the diaphragm and the intercostals. But when you need help, you can recruit other muscles. Now there are some important things here. Those other muscles are your sternocleidomastoid, right? That one that moves your head. It's not supposed to breathe, but you can use it to breathe. And I'll also tell you, how do you tell somebody's respiratory distress and somebody is just fooling you? We'll talk about that. Okay. Then you have these carlines, anterior, middle, and posterior, right? And the principal ones, like we said, are really the diaphragm and the intercostals. All the thorax does is to create the negative pressure needed for air to move into the lungs and distend the lungs. Pay attention to this right here. The distensibility of the lung in inspiration is determined by compliance forces. The reason the lung can distend and collapse is because it's elastic, right? If you have sarcoidosis and the lungs are now fibrosed, you can create negative pressure inside the thorax all you want. Air can try to rush into the lungs, but the lung will be too stiff and the air won't go in, right? So pulmonary fibrosis can determine how much air goes into the lungs, right? So very important that you understand distensibility. There are things I want you to know, terms that you must know. Distensibility is the distensibility of the lungs. How easily does it distend, right? Compliance is a more precise term that talks about the change in volume per unit change in pressure. So you see, when you say it's distensible, you can't measure that. But you can measure compliance. So compliance is the actual, how much change in volume do you get per unit change in pressure. If you get a lot of change in volume with a little pressure, you say this is a really compliant lung. If you have to put a lot of pressure to get a little bulge in the volume, that is a very stiff lung. You say the compliance is low. When does this happen? If somebody has heart failure and their lungs is waterlogged, the lung loses compliance. Right? We'll talk more about that as we go on. Right? But remember those terms. Please, please. You see, in cardiology, I was telling Alexander yesterday, right? That I want you to pay attention to how to communicate as a healthcare provider. Please. When I repeat myself on terms, it's because they're important. Like in cardiology, I don't want you telling me is that amount of blood that is left in the heart at the end of systole. Just tell me is end diastolic blood volume, right? I don't want to tell me there is more blood in the veins when we stand for a long time. No, just tell me when you stand for a long time, the venous capacitance increases. Or there is less blood going to the heart. Just tell me there is reduced venous return. Don't talk like market women. Talk like healthcare provider. You understand what I'm saying? So I want you, when you're presenting or describing anything in the hallway, and by the way you talk and the terms you use, I want people to look and say, who is that? Because you see, it is the way you speak that sometimes people size you by the way you speak. The greatest mistake people make every time in UCLA is to think I'm stupid when I go to advocate for my patients. And I get into it like, oh, right? Because they think I speak with an accent. It's a foreign dog. Probably doesn't know much. I know you know. You know. So people judge you many, many times, whether they like to admit it or not, by the way you come across. So if you start sounding, there is little return to the heart because we've been standing, you're like, what the heck are you talking about? Even though they can understand you, but because you're not using the right lingo, they will underestimate you, and they will make you feel it very quickly. And very quickly you will shrink. Believe you me, you will. If I were you, I will. I shrunk as an intern. Because you're standing with these big guys and these fellows and these residents and these medical students and these nursing students, and you're an assistant student, and the assumption is that you're in school less, so you know less. Right? So if they can dent your ego, that's it for you. You're never going to be comfortable in that environment to ask questions. Because now they make you feel like you know less, and now you don't want to prove them right by asking questions. You understand what I'm saying? So I want you to be very confident in yourself. Believe you me, at the end of my class, you know everything there is to know on that subject. I guarantee you. So be confident. You know a lot. Maybe not now, but by the time we're done, you know a lot. Okay? So learn the terms and learn to communicate precisely. That is very important. Okay? Good.
Dr. Martin.
Yes, sorry, I saw your hands.
No, that's all right. Compliance only happens during inspiration, right?
Well, let's talk about that. Does it happen during inspiration alone? Have you seen rubber bands?
Yeah.
Okay. You know rubber bands, they come in different thickness. The thin ones, easy to stretch, right? But also they collapse. They are the ones that also get loose and abandoned quickly. The thick ones, they are more difficult to pull, but they relax pretty quickly and they last longer. So there are two forces. One is compliance, that is the ease with which it extends. The strength of the recoil is called elastance, right? So compliance is how easily it stretches. Elastance is how forcefully does it recoil, right? So in real practice, we don't talk about elastance, but technically speaking, elastance is the opposite of compliance. Okay. Did I answer that question?
Yes.
Good. Excellent. So, did you see what I said here? Normal expiration is a passive process under the influence of the elastance forces. You see, so there is no muscle for expiration as such. Okay, expiration, 90% of it is under the recoil of the lungs and the relaxation of the respiratory muscles that are contracted during inspiration. Okay? Even though I know in anatomy they will tell you the external intercostals, they are for expiration, they are accessory. You don't really use them under normal circumstances. But when you become, like for instance, you're all breathing, I'm not noticing it. That is normal respiration. If anything changes, you start using these muscles, then expiration becomes active. So that is why I said, pay attention, underline that word, normal. Okay? Normal expiration is a passive process, primarily under the influence of the elastic forces. Now, this is another important, you see all these boxes? They are really the information that are very critical. Only the initial 25% of expiration can be influenced by effort. In other words, because expiration occurs under forces that are not under your control, you can't breathe out faster. You're at the mercy. For 75% of your respiration, you're at the mercy of the elastic forces and the airway restrictions and the airways. The lungs can't do, you cannot do anything to breathe out. The only time people are able to control their expiration is when they are dying. You die in expiration. That's the only time you're able to. If you've been at the bedside of people that are dying, people don't die in inspiration, they die in expiration. Okay? Because you're only able to influence the first 25% of expiration. Okay? The remaining 75% is only at the control of the elastic forces. That is why you notice people that have severe COPD, they look like they bodybuild because they can't get rid of the air by themselves. And the reason the air is not coming out, they're able to take it in. Oh yes, you can take it in by force, but you can't get it out. One of my friends died in medical school, and the last thing he said when we were at his bedside was, if I can get rid of this breath, I will not take another one. And he never survived that ER visit. So it's really important for you to pay attention to that. Expiration is 75% out of your control. It's only the initial 25% that you can control. Okay? Now, let's now go into a little bit more details on how does it really work. Let me ask you something. You remember the anatomy of the thorax, right? So you have the vertebral column, right? Then you have the sternum, right? Then you have the ribs. And they are like rulers. You know those plastic rulers that kids use in school? Those ribs are like that. And then they are curved to the front. When you take a structure that is elastic and you bend it and you anchor both ends, you have created some kind of an elastic spring, right? Because that thing wants to go back to its original state. So your ribs, because they are connected from the spine to the sternum like a rubber ruler, they function like a spring. They want to expand all the time, right? So they have that. So that is why the thorax is elastic. It acts like a spring, right? Because of that anatomy. So because this musculoskeletal anatomy of the chest wall, it gives it an elastic spring property with an inherent tendency to expand even when all the muscles are completely relaxed. In other words, even when the intercostal muscles, something, they're just hanging out. All right, that's intelligence. If she's not here, I'm lost. Okay. So it acts like an elastic spring. So even when all the muscles are completely relaxed, the chest wall is still trying to expand because of that inherent elasticity of the thorax. And because of that, that keeps the lung at 90% of the maximum volume. Okay, remember, the lungs are attached to the chest wall. So if the chest wall is always trying to expand, it's taking the lung with it all the time. So even when you're completely relaxed and you're not breathing, your lungs remain at 90% of its volume. So during respiration, your lung volume changes only by about 10%. Okay? Because that spring quality of the chest wall keeps it inflated. And that is a good thing. The reason that is a good thing is because the amount of force you need to initiate the pull of an elastic structure is usually greater than the amount of force you need to keep stretching it. So if you keep it partially inflated, almost at its near maximum volume, inspiration becomes easier because it's almost already fully inflated anyway. Right? You understand that?
Yeah.
Good. Thank you. That's a good answer.
It's like a balloon. So like when you start blowing on a balloon, it's so hard
Thank
to
you.
start.
Exactly. It's like a balloon. Exactly. Correct, Christian. All right. So the expansion force created by the relaxed chest wall counteracts the lung recoil and keep the lung at about 10% of its maximum volume, even at the end of respiration. That is the residual volume. That is why there is, because the lungs, the thorax keep the elasticity of the thorax keep the thorax at maximum 90% of its volume, and the thorax drags the lungs with it. There is a volume of air in your lungs you can never get rid of. That volume of air that you can never get rid of, because the thorax keeps expanding the lung because of its elastic spring quality, is what is called the residual volume. Okay? Now, this spring quality of the chest wall is good and is effective if you have normal amount of fat on the chest. If you have morbid obesity, I want you to remember something. When people gain weight, let's say an adult right?
That's a normal.
This is normal. He gains weight, and now people don't gain weight in the head. They only gain weight in the hand. So now, okay, let's say this is and then this is his weight right here. His thorax right there. He gains weight, and now he's like this. You realize what is happening? What am I trying to say? When you gain weight, you don't gain thoracic volume. The thoracic volume that you have when you were 120 pounds. Believe it or not, when I came to the United States in 1991, I was 6'2", 180. I had a specific, and I do marathon. Now I'm almost 268. Right? My thoracic volume is still the same as it was when I was 180. If I lie down, if I don't watch it and I become 350, yeah, my thoracic cage can have all the elastic spring in the world. It will be crushed by the amount of fat that will be extracting weight on it when I lie down. That is the reason that you get the less the expansion force, the more wall recoil and the less expansion of the lungs during respiration. What I'm trying to say here is that if you have a lot of fat on top of the chest, that spring is compromised. You're not going to be able to take a deep breath as much as you should. Everything I wrote here is what is in diagram here. Okay? So at the end of expiration, the recoil and the chest wall recoil, they are equal. Right? And there is no airflow. Right? Because airflow stops once those two forces are equal, right? Then during inspiration, the thoracic cage and the muscles, they pull the thorax, and of course the lung, they now overcome the lung recoil, so you get expansion and air moves, right? And then at the end of inspiration, the lungs, the thorax cannot expand much anymore, right? Then the lung recoil dominates during expiration and the lungs collapses, right? So this dynamic between the thorax and the lungs is really what determines inspiration and expiration. Is a play of forces between the chest wall recoil and the lung recoil. That was the bumpy ride, right? I didn't deliver that well. Do you understand what I just said? Not really. Yeah, let's go. I kind of felt what it was a rough delivery. Let's go through that again. The anatomy of the chest wall gives you the spring quality. And because it has that spring quality, that is, you're always in a state of expansion, the thoracic volume, even when all the muscles are relaxed, the thoracic volume is 90% of its maximum because of that spring quality. Okay? So what this means is that respiration only changes your thoracic volume by 10%. Okay? So when you say you inspire, the diaphragm descended and the intercostals lift at the ribs, you have the pump handle, you're only changing it by 10%. Right? But that 10% change in the volume of the thorax is what's responsible for 90% change in the volume of the lungs. Right? In such a way that when you're not breathing, because your thorax is 90% of its maximum, it keeps 10% of the lung volume unaltered. It keeps that air in the lungs that you can't get rid of. Okay? That relative difference in volume is what is responsible for the constant presence of air inside the lungs, even at the end of expiration. There is nothing you do, you cannot get rid of the residual volume. Okay? So what is important here? Remember that even when everything is relaxed, the thorax is at about 90% of the maximum volume because of its elastic quality. And because it is attached to the lungs, it pulls the lung with it in such a way that even the elastic recoil of the lung cannot get rid of 10% of lung volume. It's always there, right? And I'm saying that if you pile weight on top of the thorax, you can interfere with its ability to expand and inhale. That's what I'm saying. So what I just said here is what I tried to show. I didn't make it, you know that. So in this diagram here, to tell you that at the end of expiration, lung recoil and chest wall recoil are equal, right? During inspiration, the chest wall moves and drags the lung with it, and because the chest wall recoil is more than the lung recoil, that is why the lungs could expand, right? And you could take a deep breath. And during expiration, the same thing happens and the air moves back and forth. This diagram, if you don't understand it, I can understand. But I want you to remember one thing and don't ever forget it. At the end of expiration, the lung recoil and the chest wall recoil are equal. That's the most important part. So, circle it. At the end of expiration, lung recoil and chest wall recoil are equal. Okay? That's what I need you to know. Is that better? I hope it is. All right, so we talked about pulmonary elastance and compliance, and I already told you that they're actually equal. They are opposite to themselves. We use different terms. These physics people are the one causing all this trouble. See, compliance is the change in volume per unit change in pressure, like I told you, right? I told you that if my grandmother was going to describe the lung, you said that lung is distensible. Pretty distensible, because she's a doctor. But I'm not going to say your lung is distensible. Now I will say, no, your compliance, your pulmonary compliance is compromised. But it's okay for my wife, who's an accountant, to say, she's not breathing right. Right? I have to be able to say, no, she's tachypnea, she's dyspneic, or she's in respiratory distress. Because those things have meaning. They determine a course of action. So you have to call it crisis to take the money from defense. So you have to use the right term. Good. So even though compliance is a measure of distensibility, we prefer to call it compliance. Normal compliance of a normal lung is 0.2 liters per centimeters of water. Okay, that's the normal compliance. So that means every centimeter of water increases the intrapulmonary pressure. Every centimeter of water increase in transpulmonary pressure causes a lung volume to increase by 0.2 liters. Okay, that's the normal compliance. Okay. Decreased compliance reflects pulmonary fibrosis. We're talking about that, right? Scarring with increased pulmonary collagen. And that's what happens in restrictive lung disease. You see, in restrictive lung disease, the lungs are not able to be extended and they collapse very fast. So the lung never gets fully inflated. So you get restrictive lung disease. TB is a good example. Increased compliance reflects alveolar septal disruption and loss of elastin. That is what you find in COPD. Because remember that, let me ask you something. If you get, okay, let me ask you, Stanley, have you had to change your breath before?
No.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, come on. There are times I wear my brief and it's sagging, right? Because
You change your underwear?
Briefs.
Oh,
Yeah, underwear.
that's British, man.
Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. Oh, briefs. What do you call it?
Underpants.
Yeah. Box?
Yeah.
Not everybody wears boxes,
Underpants,
man.
bro.
No, underpants, whatever it is called, right? You have to change it sometimes because it sags. Because they want the elastic band at the top, start getting loose, it's gone. You can stretch it from here to downtown and it will keep going. Right? So you see, what happens in COPD is the airway is obstructed. So the air is not getting out. So the patient takes a breath, it's not able to fully exhale, he takes the next breath. So the breath begins to stack. So you have stacking of breath. As you stack breath, you begin to stretch the lung, Once you go past the elastic limit, you lose lung recoil. And the lungs become super compliant. Like when your underpants loses elasticity, it's super compliant, right? So that is why I say increased compliance reflects alveolar septal disruption, because you have stretched the lungs so much, you've lost all the alveolar barrier. So instead of the lungs looking like it should normally look, with air cavities, these new septals, right? It is not like this. One single cavity. You've lost alveolar walls, so they have collapsed and all of that. What is the downside to that?
Yes, gas exchange.
Thank you, because now that means you have less surface area available for gas exchange. Right? Okay. But in terms of what I'm talking about right now, it's increased compliance. And COPD is a good example, and it's a big problem. The opposite of compliance is elastance, is the force generated by the pulmonary distension, is the pressure change associated with a unit change in volume. Okay? It's the opposite of compliance. We don't talk about it, I just put this here for completion's sake. Okay? So it's a measure of elastic recall determined by tissue forces, increased collagen to elastin ratio, and alveolar surface tension, decrease surfactant levels. And you'll be like, what the heck are you talking about? It's like I'm speaking in tongues, right? Okay. Let's go through them one by one. In the tissue, especially in the human tissue, including the skin, you have two types of tissue structures that are found in every tissue, but you understand it better with the skin. You're all born with 50% elastin and 50% collagen in most of your tissue. Why is that the case? Because in most of your tissue, you want your tissue to be able to stretch, but you want to put a limit to that stretch so it doesn't rupture or destroy itself. A good example is the arteries, aorta. You want the aorta to be able to expand during systole and take all of the left ventricular output, right? But you don't want it to rupture. So you need collagen to limit the extent to which it can distend. You know what collagen is? You've eaten drumstick before. See that white tissue, especially when it's from KFC? That stuff bleeds even after it's fried sometimes. Right? That tough one that is difficult to bite off the bone is the collagen. It's very rigid structure. That stringy one is the elastin. Right? So they are supposed to be 50-50. As you age, you lose elastin and you gain collagen. That's why we wrinkle. Right? That is why your blood vessels, they become rigid and stiff with age. That is why you can get that auscultatory gap you guys talked about in that physical diagnostic class. When the vessels is rigid in elderly folks. Okay? So, whenever you have increased collagen to elastin ratio, the lungs become like really rigid, right? When the alveolar surface tension, so you can imagine the alveolar walls are supposed to be separated by air, but supposing now you have pneumonia, and instead of air, you have pus. They're going to collapse, and they're going to behave exactly like those two slides behave. That will contribute to your elastin. And that is exactly what happened in ARDS. ARDS is acute respiratory distress syndrome. It's a very deadly condition. It's a pulmonary emergency. When kids are born prematurely, they end up with that stuff, right? Because the reason you wouldn't develop it as an adult is because you have this surfactant. Surfactant is like soap. Okay, let me ask you again. You take two slides, you dip them in regular water, and you touch it together, and you try to separate them. It's very difficult. But if you dip them in soap water, and you put them together, they stick together and separate easy because of the soap. The soap agent in the lungs that prevents the alveolar walls from sticking together is what is called surfactant. When kids are born prematurely, they don't have enough surfactants. So when the alveolar walls collapse, it gets stuck together and they can't breathe. Many, many times we have to put them on life support. Okay? So these are the reasons why you will have increased elastins. Okay? That is a good one, right? You got that. Excellent. Any questions? Okay. Moving on. So, elastance is an inverse of, I hope you know how to read my slide, right? You see, when I put a bullet, everything I'm talking about here is about this thing here, right? Everything under here is about this thing here, right? Good. When I come back here, that means what I'm talking about has nothing to do with this, but has a lot to do with this. You figure it out, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So, elastance is an inverse of compliance. The more elastance, the less compliance. The more elastance, the less compliance. Why did I do that?
You wanted to get the point across.
Yeah. That's weird. I don't do that. There's a reason. What I'm trying to say here is, you know, what I do is I say things backward and forward to make sure I reinforce. I think what I'm trying to say here is the more elastance, the less compliance. The less elastance, the more compliance. That's what I'm trying to say. So fix it. Right? I'll fix it on my end later on. Yeah. So maybe when I get to my 80 years old, I'll start repeating myself. But not now. So normal elastance is 5 centimeters per liter. Those numbers, you can learn them if you want, but I will never test you. I don't think anybody will test you. You just need to know. Okay? Good. Any questions? Yeah.
Can you explain how the increased compliance reflects that?
Okay, so you have a patient with obstruction. They take in breath, but they can't get rid of it. So with each breath, they were able to exhale some and they retain some. Then the next breath comes. So the breath start getting stacked. The lungs start getting distended. When you begin to distend the lungs, you begin to rupture alveolar septal walls. So alveoli that are supposed to be like this, you begin to rupture walls and they begin to look like this. So the lung becomes super distensive. That's what I was explaining about. Once you exceed the elastic limit of the lung, just stretch it out as far as you want. That is how the compliance increases. That is how the disruption of the alveolar septal wall is a reflection of the fact that the lung already exceeded its elastic limit and is like just ready to be stretched as far as you need it. Okay. Good. All right. So now that you know what compliance is, you know what elastance is, let's take a look at how do these forces interact and determine how you do with your breath. So there is something called airway resistance. That is the resistance to flow of air in the airway. Okay? It arises from friction among the gas molecules, between the gas molecules and the walls of the airways. Okay? $80 to 90% of airway resistance airway resistance accounts for 80 to 90% of resistance to respiratory airway flow. Okay? Let me connect this well for you. I think the connection, that connection is not very good. You remember we talked about compliance here? Okay. And now I'm talking about compliance and airway resistance. Up until now, I have given you the impression that the distensibility of the lungs is a major determinant factor in how much air gets into your lungs. Right? You've gotten that from me. This slide is telling you that is not the whole story. Okay. Pulmonary compliance is only a part of the story. So, in addition to pulmonary compliance, there is airway resistance. Okay? And now, I'm going to, because we already talked about pulmonary compliance, now I'm going to talk about airway resistance. Okay? And I'm trying to define it here. And I said airway resistance comes from the friction among gas molecules and between gas molecules and the wall of the airways. That's just what it is. I mean, remember gas molecules, remember that all this oxygen in the air that we can't see, they are bouncing off of themselves, knocking off themselves, and bouncing off of the wall. And everywhere, that's the way it is. The natural order is chaos, right? Okay. So, 90% of resistance to respiratory airway is from airway resistance. Are you following me? So if I tell you which is the most determined, the major determinant factor of airway resistance, of resistance to flow in the airway, you will not tell me it's compliance. No, you will tell me no, 90% of resistance to flow of air inside the respiratory system is airway resistance. Is the resistance in the airway, not the lungs.
And
okay?
And that's natural.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's natural.
That's
Yes.
okay.
That's the normal thing,
Okay.
right? Now the question is, what are the things that contribute to that airway resistance? First is airflow rate. Airflow rate. The rate at which air is flowing. Let me ask you something. If you all try to get, all of you try to get out of this room through that door in 1 minute, you will be bruised and you'll be bloody, right? Because you're going to have a lot of resistance trying to do that in one minute. But if you do it in 10 minutes, you'll be able to get out in 10 minutes and you'll be fine. Because if you try to do it in 1 minute, you bump yourself and hurt yourselves, right? So the same thing I'm saying here, that airway flow, the airflow rate is a major determinant of airway resistance. The body tries to reduce airway resistance by branching. So instead of the air comes through the trachea, and immediately the trachea divides into the bronchi, and the bronchi divide into smaller bronchi and into bronchioles. All of that division is slowing down airflow rate. Remember, that is exactly what happens with the arterial system. You create divisions to slow down rate. Okay? And I'm telling you here that between the trachea and the alveoli, there are 23 branching of the airways. All of that is aimed at reducing the flow, okay? And therefore reducing airway resistance. Now, another thing is airway diameter. If I have you come out of this door in 1 minute, you hurt yourself. But if I have them double this entrance, or maybe triple this entrance, and put it here, I add you, all of you get out in 1 minute, you will get out, okay, because the door is wide, right? Exactly what I'm saying here. The airway diameter also is a major determinant of airway resistance. And that is why, remember in pharmacology, we have medication that relax the airway when the airway is constricted, is to reduce the resistance, right? And it's modulated by the autonomic nervous system, right? Everybody remember that?
Yeah.
Good, excellent. One, tell me something. Which part of the autonomic nervous system will reduce the airway diameter? The parasympathetic. Okay, good. Now, there is a relationship I need you to know. You don't need to, I just need you to know it. You don't need to memorize this. You know, like when I talk about Boyle's law, Dalton's law, these are things I'm hoping that you have done sometime in high school or undergrad. You may not remember it, so I want to reference it so it makes sense to you what I'm about to say. Alveolar radius, the radius of the alveoli is another major determinant of airway resistance. Okay? And that relationship is defined by Laplace law. Laplace law says that the pressure that you need to open an alveolus depends on the radius of the alveolus and the surface tension of the fluid lining that alveolus. Okay? And that is the relationship. P equals 2T over R, where T is surface tension, R is the radius, and P is the pressure you need to open it up. So let's take a look at this. So if air comes in through here, you will need a higher pressure to get air to go in here than you will need to go in here. So this H is high pressure, this L is low pressure, right? So I give you an example. So if you take an alveolus with a radius of 1, whatever that 1 might be for you, and say surface tension of 3, you need a pressure of about 6 to get air to go in there. If you increase the radius to 2, you need 3. Why is this important? The reason this is important is when you have atelectasis, airway collapse, you begin to get alveoli that are losing air because they're collapsing. And remember, I told you the lungs are very passive in respiration. So when the thorax creates negative pressure, the alveoli that is collapsing will get less air. But the ones that are normal, they'll get more air. That is the reason when we put people on ventilator, we always increase the end expiratory pressure to make sure that we keep the alveoli partially open, to make sure that, so that the subsequent inspiration is easier. If you allow them to collapse, then it becomes more difficult to inflate on the subsequent breath. Okay? You understand that I was talking about critical care, but I just need you to know now. Okay? But that is clear, right? So now you know that for you to get air into the lungs, you need to have a good lung that has good compliance, and you have to have very minimal airway resistance, right? Those are major factors. Y'all with me so far, right? Good. Now let's talk a little bit more about respiration back at the ranch. Okay, so normal inspiration requires only about -3 to -5 centimeters of water relative to the atmospheric pressure. So the alveolar pressure only needs to change from -3 to -5, and you will get air into the lungs. But the inspiratory muscles, they can generate a maximum inspiratory force of up to 60 to 100 centimeters of water below the atmospheric pressure. You understand what I'm saying here, right? Why is it important for us to know? That tells you that the human being was created to be able to deal successfully with any difficulty that might be related to breathing. He carries a lot of reserve. He needs only -5, but he can actually generate -100. Okay? And that is demonstrated by Mueller maneuver and Passalver. You know Miller maneuver? You all know Vasavi,
Yeah.
right? What is Miller?
Close your nose and your mouth when you try to breathe in.
Huh?
Close your nose and your mouth when you try to breathe in.
Breathing. Okay, exactly. So you can actually measure the amount of pressure a person can generate by inspiration. And that is called the negative inspiratory force. It's one of the things we measure before we take people off of it. Okay, before you take somebody off of the breathing machine, you measure the ability to generate negative inspiratory force. Okay, it's called NIF. Sometimes it's called sniff if you just measure it spontaneously. So then there's an S in front of it. Sniff. Okay. So, lung volumes increase under inspiratory pressure until a limiting volume is reached, usually at about 30 centimeters of water, when the pulmonary compliance approaches zero and flow of air stops. So everything I told you at the beginning, that the thorax generates negative pressure and air goes into the lungs, I'm repeating it. It's exactly what I'm repeating. But the only difference between what I said an hour ago at the beginning and now is that I'm giving you numbers. I'm giving you by how much is the pressure changing and what is happening to compliance as air is rushing into the lungs. Okay? Now, we already said normal respiration is a passive process. You don't even need muscles to expire. You don't need muscle to breathe out. But yet, there are muscles in your body that can generate up to 150 centimeters of water in pressure. This is a reserve we carry. That is the reason people smoke and they don't get sick quick. And more people keep smoking because they think it's okay. It's because you carry tremendous pulmonary reserve. It will not affect you early, but believe you me, no, it is affecting you. You won't feel it early because of the reserve you carry. And once that reserve is out, you're dead. So this one is demonstrated by Vasavi maneuver. Forced respiration, especially in patients with obstructive airway disease, compresses the airway and compounds airway resistance, making it difficult for the elastance forces to complete expiration, leading eventually to air trapping in the lungs. What is that? So think about it. If you try to force expiration, what you do is you create a positive pressure in the thorax, right? What that positive pressure does is to compress the lungs. So let me make sure you understand. So, imagine that we're looking at lungs like that, not from the front, but from the side. How do I do that? If I'm looking at lung from the side, it will look like this. Right? Imagine that this is a tiny airway, one of the airways, tiny one, right? Surrounded by all the other tiny airways, right? This tiny airway is connected to the lung tissue, right? Right? This is an airway. When I take a deep breath and the lung expands, what will it do to this airway? It will pull it open more. And then when I stop taking in breath and the lungs recoil, if I don't interfere, the lungs will recoil to its normal volume and this airway will come to its normal size. But if I interfere and I compress, I create positive pressure in the thorax that compresses the lung, I will compromise the patency of the airway. Right? That is the reason that we always tell asthmatic patients to breathe out slowly, and COPD patient, because if you try to breathe out with so much force, all you do is you compound the problem. You compress the lungs and you close the airway. You make the obstruction worse. That's why slow breath is what you want people that have airway obstruction like asthmatics to do. Slow, breathe out slowly. Don't force it. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to say here. Forced expiration, especially in patients with obstructive airway diseases, compresses the airway and compounds the airway resistance, making it difficult for the elastance forces to complete expiration. Okay, so that now get air trapping. You got that? Excellent. So let's talk about respiration. How do you know when somebody, the work of respiration, how do we compute the work of respiration? The work of respiration is a mathematical term, okay? Breathing is work. It is the product of change in pressure needed to inflate the lungs and the lung volume change. So if you multiply the change in pressure by the change in volume in the lungs, you have the work of breathing computed for you. Okay? If either the resistance to airflow increases or the compliance decreases, then the work of respiration will increase and respiration becomes more difficult. Difficult respiration is what we call dyspnea. It's not dyspnea, it's dyspnea. The P is silent. Okay? Don't forget that. They will laugh at you. Dyspnea. Say it. Dyspnea. Thank you. The respiratory muscles will have to generate more force to overcome added load. That is what, whenever the volume, you lose compliance, the lung becomes stiff, or the airway closes in bronchoconstriction, the work of breathing is increased, right? And the respiratory muscles have to do more work. There was something they didn't say in that physical diagnosis class that is important that you know. How do you then identify dyspnea? You all know tachypnea, right? Tachypnea is the person is breathing fast. What is the difference between tachypnea and respiratory distress? Annette? Thank you. So, respiratory distress is when you have tachypnea and dyspnea together. That is respiratory distress. If somebody has tachypnea, but they don't have dyspnea, step back. They're fooling you. Because you see the clinical manifestation of dyspnea, you can't mimic, you can't create. When people are dyspneic, you're looking at them, with every breath, their nose is flaring. The trachea is tugging. There is supraclavicular recession. Okay? The sternocleidomastoid is very prominent. And you could see intercostal recession. You know, with the inspiration, everything is getting sucked in because and that is why we used to call it air hunger. The thorax are trying very hard to suck that air in, that they suck everything around the ring in. So, as a clinician, you must be clear in your mind when somebody is in respiratory distress and when they are tachypneic. The patient walked up to me one time, said, "Doctor, I'm dying. And he's trying to fake tachypnea. And I was like, okay, I just stood there, I was looking at him. I didn't see anything. I didn't walk away. I was just looking at him. And I was in my mind, I was like, you really think I'm that stupid? And after a while, he stopped. Like, won't you help me? I'm like, you don't need help. Why are you doing? Then, he now started telling me all these stories. I wanted me to prescribe Valium for anxiety. See, it's easy for somebody to fake tachypnea, but they can't fake dyspnea. That's why it's important. What you want to respond to. Somebody might come to you and you ask them, "Oh, how are you doing?" "Well, I'm just a little bit under the weather." But they're tachypneic and they're flaring in their nose. Even though they may not have tracheal talk, they may not have all the other ones, but the nose is flaring with every breath. That's the question you want to make sure you get a pulse ox on. You may not be all over giving you the blues, but it's really sick. You need to recognize that sign. Okay? You're good? Excellent. All right, so let's talk about some important concepts. Lung volumes. Very important. Everybody talks about it. Lung volumes and capacity. A lung volume is a volume change in the lung. Capacity are usually additions of volumes. Okay? When we add one volume to another, we call it capacity. Okay? So, you're sitting there quietly listening to me. You're breathing in, breathing out at the same rate. That is your tidal volume. Like you stay at the beach side, you're looking at the ocean, it rises and falls at a regular pace. No tsunamis, nothing, everything is at baseline. That is your tidal volume. You can do more than your tidal volume if need be, but if you don't have any need for it, nobody does it, unless they're crazy. Now, if you decide to sneeze, or you lit up and you want to blow up your lighter, you go, right? So you take extra breath so you can have enough to waste to blow off your lighter. That extra breath that you take in from your baseline, right, is your inspiratory reserve volume. You see that? This is your tidal volume going up and down. That extra breath you can take above and beyond your tidal volume is your inspiratory reserve volume. Okay? If you add your tidal volume to your inspiratory reserve volume, you get inspiratory capacity. Okay? I don't know what you're writing. It's all over there. Okay. Now, the extra air you can breathe out after a regular tidal expiration is expiratory reserve volume. Okay? And that part of the air in your lung that you can never get rid of is your residual volume. If you add expiratory reserve volume to inspiratory capacity, you get vital capacity. Okay? And that's what it's showing here. If you add this to this, and you go from here to here, that is your vital capacity. Okay? If you add vital capacity to residual volume, that is your total lung capacity. Okay? If you add expiratory reserve volume to your residual volume, that is your functional residual capacity. Okay? Everything is easy. All you really need to work this out somehow, let me help you. Whenever it includes the residual volume, it is your functional residual capacity. And it's usually what is left. It's an expiratory affair. Okay? Everything else is easy. Tidal volume, add that to inspiratory reserve volume, you get inspiratory capacity. In other words, tidal volume is what you're doing, but you can do more than that. You have the capacity to do more. So if you add what you can do more above and beyond what you're already doing at baseline, that's your capacity, it's your inspiratory capacity. And if you do the opposite for expiration, you have expiratory reserve volume. But because we don't really care too much, what the heck is expiratory reserve capacity? Who needs that? Does anybody need expiratory reserve capacity? Well, I mean, expiration is not even under your control. And you always breathe out because your lungs are the ones that control that. It's not yours. So that's why there is nothing like expiratory reserve capacity on here, right? You have expiratory reserve volume and you have residual volume, okay? And when you add those two up, you get functional residual volume, okay? So just this one, everybody texts, and I test it. I'll tell you which of the following are the components of functional residual capacity, and I'll give you a bunch of numbers and stuff like that. So this is a very important slide, okay? You must know those volumes and practice, test yourself. Okay, so, is this where I want to go? All right, so now, remember, I told you that you take a deep breath, it's under your control. Once your maximum lung volume is reached, you stop taking breath in, air comes out, but the rate at which it comes out, you're only able to influence the first 25%. The last 75% is not under your control. So if you put a meter in front of somebody's nose, and you close the mouth, and you measure how air flows, okay? And this is flow, and this is volume. And this is your total lung capacity right here. So you start from here, okay? Mark this so you know how to read this stuff. So you start from here. Once you create negative pressure in your lungs, air flows and it increases for a while. Everything is under control. And then as your lungs are reaching lung capacity, flow begins to diminish. Once you are at total lung capacity, flow stops, right? And then expiration begins. Expiration you can influence for the first 25%, so it's faster and the steep is higher, right? The remaining 75% is not under your control. It continues on from here at a regular rate until it's time to breathe in again. This is called the flow volume loop. Okay? The way you read it is you start from here. And the way you know you should start from here is you see here that this is total lung capacity. So this is your maximum point. If this is your maximum point, then this has got to be your minimum point, right? Good. So that's how you read it. Now let's talk about this. Why do we care about this? Because when somebody has obstructive airway disease, right? Look up, listen. If somebody has obstructive airway disease, they will take a good breath in. You see, the inspiratory part of it is normal. They will be able to influence the first 25%, so that part is normal. The remaining is messed up because of that obstruction. They can't influence it. So that obstruction is going to slow it down. So that gets like this. Instead of coming out nice.
It's okay. It's like Texas.
Talk it again.
Somewhere else.
Just don't touch
Like,
it.
There you go.
All right. So you see, the obstruction get messed up, and you see how difficult the airflow is. It becomes messed up. This is what you see in somebody with obstructive lung disease. Okay? This is the pattern. Recognize it. Now, if somebody has pulmonary fibrosis, it looks normal, but look at the volume. It's shrunken because the lungs is so stiff, the lungs cannot be distended, right? So the whole thing it has a normal configuration, but the range is really constricted, right? So this is the pattern, the flow volume loop pattern of a restrictive airway disease. You got it? Mm-hmm. Okay, and that is why I was just telling you, I'm explaining everything I just said here. I think it's clear. Normal inspiration flows, accelerated, yada, yada, yada. I think you get this. All right, let's go. Oh, I should give you a break, right? You need a break?
After this.
Why? Come on, I'm entertaining you. You're going to break from entertainment
No, we have a break after this last remember.
after this line.
Yeah. Your break is coming.
Okay. All right, so. So this is comparative restrictive flow volume loops. Just again telling you the thoracic muscle. So supposing you have okay, supposing you don't have a lung disease, you have a thoracic wall problem. How would your flow volume look? This is normal, right? This is restrictive. You see, the restrictive it has a normal configuration, but it's smaller. If you have a thoracic wall problem, say you have Guillain-Barré. Guillain-Barré is an autoimmune disease that people start developing ascending paralysis. And sometimes it will take out their thoracic muscles and they won't be able to breathe. If you do flow volume loop on them, it looks constricted, but the difference is the configuration is abnormal. You got it? So when it looks, the volumes are shrunk, but the configuration is preserved, that is a restrictive lung disease. If the volume is shrunken, but the configuration is lost, that is a thoracic wall problem. So you know, like, why is this important? Osteoporosis is very common in the West, the Western world. So you sometimes see 80-year-old people that have kyphosis, right? And their daughters will bring them to you, say, my mom can breathe. And then you're wondering, they can't stand straight to do chest x-ray. You're listening, everything is sounding clear. Why is the breath problem? Because when you have kyphosis, and sometimes it's so bad, it's not just kyphosis, it's kyphosis and scoliosis. So the patients are messed up, the ribs are crowded, nothing can move. When you put them on a flow volume loop, you see that. Okay. And that tells you, okay, this patient is fine. And then you ask them, are you willing to do spine surgery for this? And they will say, I don't want nobody coming on me. I say, fine. So let's just figure out a way to give her oxygen and keep her going. Give her along. Okay? But you need to be able to know when you're going to treat and when you're going to just comfort and console. Okay? Extremely important.
So that happens because like the ribs can't recoil?
Yes. Ribs can't contract or recoil. There's no movement. Everything is like this, crowded down and stuff like that. Right. Okay?
You said they're okay technically, it's just different in configuration.
The lungs are fine. It's just that the thorax cannot do what it would normally do. The bucket handle movement is lost. The pump handle thing is gone. Diaphragm is descending and ascending, but the thorax is not expanding because not only is this scoliotic and kyphotic, sometimes there is arthritis, spinal arthritis as well. And so it's a very, very beautiful condition. You see, it almost breaks your heart all the time. Yeah. Right.
So you would give oxygen?
You just give them oxygen if they're short of breath. You give oxygen because, I mean, seriously, you've not seen cases like this? Kyphosis and scoliosis. They can't even go into the CT scan machine. They can't stand to do x-rays. You have to depend on your skills to listen to the lungs, make sure it's clear and everything is fine. And you just, okay, we'll give home oxygen. Of course, you'll do the test and you'll find out. Okay?
And Guillain-Barré is included as far as like the scoliosis, kyphosis, and arthritis?
Because, yeah, anything that thoracic muscle paralysis, kyphosis, scoliosis is an example of bony disease. Guillain-Barré, tick paralysis are examples of muscle disease. Yeah, well, don't worry about that. We'll have more fun with those down the road. Okay. Now you have your break. 3 minutes. Don't try to get out in 1 minute. Oh, okay. Well. 5 minutes. I was kidding.
So I know when you're talking about the alveolar collection, you'll get less. So you said treatment for that, you increase the expiratory.
I was looking on the thing, I'm like, what is this? That's okay. All right. So any last minute question? Everything is clear to you, right? Right? So far so good? Everybody is good. Please don't get confused with what is happening in the chest wall and what is happening in the lungs. You have chest wall compliance, you also have pulmonary compliance. You have chest wall recoil, you have pulmonary recoil. But when it comes to airway resistance, you're only talking about diameter, length, and airway, the air bubbles themselves. Okay? Please get that really clear. I don't want you to get confused like murmurs and hard sounds. Okay? All right. Excellent. And let me just leak some of the questions to you. Listen, notice here, airflow rate is a determinant of airway resistance. Airway diameter is a determinant of airway resistance. Alveolar radius is a determinant of airway resistance. Is airway length there? Good, all right. Okay, so I'm switching gear now. So we've talked about respiration, right? Respiratory system and respiration. Really, we talked about respiration as external and internal respiration. See, anything that has to do with air exchange, carbon dioxide leaving, oxygen coming in, that is external respiration because it is happening outside of the cell. When you feed that oxygen into the mitochondria and it gets burnt up and ATP gets generated, that is internal respiration. Okay? So, but we're going to talk more in a little bit more detail about external respiration. How do you get oxygen into the blood? How do you get carbon dioxide out of the blood? So we're going to talk about gas exchange. The first thing you need to know is that the rate at which carbon dioxide is given up and oxygen is taken up in the alveolus is not the same. It's not 1-to-1. Okay? And that ratio is what we call the respiratory quotient. And the way you compute it is you look at the volume of oxygen that is given out, and carbon dioxide that is given out, and oxygen that is consumed. That is the quotient. That quotient, it varies really with your diet. If you are consuming primarily carbohydrate, it approaches 1. If you're on high-fat diet, it goes down to 0.8. If you're taking a lot of protein, it goes to 0.7. Kat talks about this. Okay. But why am I telling you about this? I'm not a nutritionist. I don't care about this thing. The only reason I'm talking about it is because sometimes I need to know how much oxygen is in the alveoli. And I cannot measure it. But if I know what the respiratory quotient is, and I know what the carbon dioxide is in the blood, I can compute what that oxygen volume is. And that becomes important as we move forward. Just remember that. For me, why am I talking about respiratory quotient in pulmonology class? Because I need this quotient to be able to compute the volume of oxygen in the alveolus. Okay?
So you're saying the respiratory quotient varies depending on what your diet is?
Yes. Yeah. It is not 1-to-1. On high-fat diet is 1 oxygen for 1 carbon dioxide. It's more carbon dioxide for oxygen. The ratio differs depending on what you're eating. It averages 0.8 on a mixed diet. So that means 8 molecules of carbon dioxide are given off for every 10 molecules of oxygen taken up. Okay? Respiratory quotient is sometimes manipulated in patients with severe COPD to reduce the carbon dioxide production. You got it? So Kat, when Cat is a nutritionist, you all know that, right? So when patients are COPD, they will come and they will give you a dietary prescription to minimize the amount of carbon dioxide the patient generates. Since the problem is getting rid of carbon dioxide, the less you generate, the less you have to get rid of. So it's part of management. Okay? Now, the amount of oxygen taken up from the alveoli into the blood depends on a number of factors. Okay? So the amount of oxygen that will eventually end up inside blood, because remember, air gets into the alveoli, right? And in the alveolar wall, you have the capillaries. At the alveolar capillary membrane is where the transaction takes place, right? So it doesn't just happen. Oxygen does not just get to that alveoli and the blood is like, oh, okay, you can come in now. No, it goes through, there are some specific factors that determine how oxygen moves from the alveoli into the blood. The partial pressure of oxygen in the blood is important, okay, because that is the pressure that will push the oxygen into the blood. The solubility of oxygen in plasma. That oxygen has to go through the membrane. It has to dissolve in plasma before it is taken up by hemoglobin. Right? So the solubility is important. That hemoglobin has to be free. Right? If that hemoglobin is not free, yeah, oxygen might be in plasma, it's not going to pick it up. For instance, carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin exactly like oxygen. So patients from burning that are rescued from burning buildings, they are very hypoxic. Not because there is no oxygen, because they are rescued from a place where oxygen is causing the fire. But the carbon monoxide is binding the hemoglobin, and they are looking cherry red like they have blood everywhere, but they don't have oxygen because the carbon monoxide is taking off the oxygen. So the hemoglobin has to be free. It has to have the carrying capacity. There has got to be, not only does it have to be free, there has got to be enough of it. That is why anemia can cause hypoxia, right? Because there isn't enough oxygen to carry oxygen, enough hemoglobin to carry oxygen, right? And then finally, the hemoglobin must be fully saturated, right? So, given all that, how do I get rid of this? No? All right, fine. But you can read through it. So you can actually compute. How do we determine the oxygen content in somebody's blood? What is the amount of oxygen in your blood? This is the formula. 0.003 is actually the solubility coefficient for oxygen, right? And this is the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood. Okay, if you multiply the solubility coefficient of oxygen and the partial pressure, that gives you the amount of oxygen that is dissolved in plasma, right? Then you add that to the amount of blood that is carried by the hemoglobin. 1 gram of hemoglobin carries 1.36 mils of oxygen. So you multiply 1.36 mil, which is a constant, with the patient's hemoglobin that is now 15 gram, that's about normal, right? And then you multiply that by 100, which is, you're assuming that that hemoglobin is fully saturated. So if I give you all these parameters, and I can tell you what is the oxygen content in the blood of a 70 kg man, yada yada yada, and I'll give you the CBC and all this stuff. That is how you compute the oxygen content in somebody's blood, right? Coefficient times partial pressure, hemoglobin times that to 1.36 times 100. Got that? Good. Moving on. Okay. partial pressure of oxygen, the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveolar air is very important. It determines, that is the pressure head that is going to push oxygen into the blood. Okay? Are you with me?
Yes.
Oxygen has to go inside blood from the alveoli. The pressure of oxygen in the alveoli is very important in the process of getting oxygen to go into the blood, because that is the pressure head that pushes it into the blood. Okay? This is the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood. Okay? This number here is the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood. That partial pressure determines how much oxygen dissolves in plasma. I want it to be very clear. There is a difference between the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood and the partial pressure of oxygen inside the alveoli. The partial pressure of oxygen inside the alveoli determines the partial pressure of oxygen inside the blood, because that is the pressure that pushes oxygen into the blood. And if it pushes a lot of it, then the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood will also be fine. So under normal circumstances, the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli and the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood, if the lung was a perfect machine, should be the same. Right? Right?
Yes.
If the alveolar capillary membrane is a perfect membrane that allows every single oxygen molecule that makes it into the alveoli to go into the blood, then the partial pressure of oxygen inside the alveolus should be equal to the partial pressure of oxygen inside the blood. Right? Good. You understand that? If it was a perfect machine, but it's not. And because it is not, there is something called alveolar arterial AA oxygen gradient. Okay? Because that membrane is not perfect. Not all the oxygen that makes it to the alveoli makes it into the blood. And the imperfection of that unit increases with age. So there is always an alveolar arterial AA oxygen gradient. We generally call it AA gradient. Okay? So alveolar PO2 determines arterial PCO2. AA gradient is the difference between the alveolar. The big A is alveolar, the little a is arterial. Okay? So the AA gradient is the difference between those two. It reflects the functional integrity of the alveolar capillary unit. Okay? Normal AA gradient you can compute. Actually, we don't compute it, we estimate it. Okay? The way you estimate it is you divide the patient's age by 4 and you add 4 to it. So what is your AA gradient at 20? Good. What would it be at 50? No, 60. Okay, I'm right the next. Huh? At 60? Okay, that's easier. At 80? 90, you're right. Okay, good. So you divide the age by 4 and you add 4 to it. Okay? What are you doing?
We thought you said 60, so I'm like, what was it?
Huh?
We thought you said 60. Well, I did.
At 60 was 19, was right. Yeah, but my brain didn't catch it. And since I'm a teacher, I decide when you right? So, you divide the 8 by 4 and you add 4 to it. So that's the estimate. So, tell me, calculate your own A gradient right now. Don't tell me what numbers. It increases by 1 millimeter of mercury every 10 years of life. Okay? Forget about that one, because this is the formula we depend on to compute what's normal. Okay? Whenever your AA gradient is abnormal, that means something is interfering with the ability of oxygen to travel across the membrane from the alveolar into the capillary. And you really want to know what the severity is. Normal to mild defect is 10 to 30. Mild to moderate defect, 30 to 50. Moderate to severe, more than 50. So whenever the AA gradient is more than 50, you have a lot to worry about. That means something is wrong. That means all the oxygen that is getting into the alveoli is not getting to the blood. What could cause that? A number of things. There is something called diffusion defect. In other words, the barrier is so thick, fibrous, scarred, damaged, that oxygen can't go through it. It's sealed. Right? Instead of looking like fabric, it's looking more like nylon, completely sealed. We call that diffusion defect. That means the problem is between the alveolars and the capillary membrane itself. It's a diffusion problem. Okay. Then there is something called ventilation perfusion mismatch. A mismatch is when you are getting your right and left hand confused. Mismatching. So when we say ventilation perfusion mismatch, we're saying that somehow the alveoli is ventilated, air got there, but blood didn't make it there. So there was ventilation, but there isn't perfusion. And there are two ways that could happen. If somebody has pneumonia, look at the normal. A normal alveoli is supposed to be empty so that air can go into it. So if somebody has pneumonia, or they have pulmonary edema, or they have a condition called alveolar proteinosis, where the alveoli sheds its own membrane into its own cavity, right? You see, instead of the alveolar being open, it's closed. So the air comes all the way down here and it can't get into the alveoli. So this is an alveoli. Blood will flow through it, but that blood will never get exposed to air. So this is an example of ventilation perfusion mismatch, right? Yeah.
So
Okay.
so you said it was air gets there, but blood doesn't?
No.
Or is it blood?
A normal alveoli,
Yeah.
air gets there,
Yeah.
and the blood is in the wall, and they get exposed to themselves. The exchange takes place and goes. In this case, pneumonia is pus in there. Pulmonary embolism and pulmonary edema is water. Proteinosis is fluid. The alveoli is filled. So air gets to this junction right here, but it cannot go into the alveolus to make contact with the membrane where the exchange takes place. Even though blood will flow through that membrane, that blood will never get exposed to air. When that happens, that is an example of ventilation perfusion mismatch, where there is perfusion but there isn't ventilation. Right?
And the opposite will be true when there is a...
Now, if you have pulmonary embolism, where the pulmonary artery is blocked by an embolus, well, air will get to the alveoli, right? Air will get to the alveoli, but it can't make contact with blood because the blood is blocked. So that is another example of a VQ mismatch. Ventilation perfusion. Perfusion is Q all the time. Quantity of blood, right? So another reason why AA gradient might be widened is alveolar filling disorders, So those are like pneumonia, pulmonary edema. And when the alveoli is filled, it's called an alveolar filling disorders. It could be filled with water, as in pulmonary edema. It could be filled with blood, as in pulmonary hemorrhage. It could be filled with pus, as in pneumonia. And it could be filled with protein fluid, as in alveolar proteinosis. So, but all together, they are called alveolar filling disorders. And pulmonary embolism. These are the two conditions where this happens. There is a third condition. I don't know why it's not here. Let me see. Maybe there's a reason I left it out. I didn't want to confuse you guys. Okay, I don't know why I left it out. But there is a third condition called shock. Okay. Remember I talked to you about ARDS, where the alveolar wall is collapsed. Right. Where the alveolar wall is collapsed, blood flows right through from pulmonary artery to pulmonary vein without getting exposed to air at all. So it behaves like a shunt, shunting blood from the arterial side to the venous side, right? And in that case, the AA gradient again will be wide. Okay? Good. I think there's a reason I didn't put it here. All right, good. So now you've seen AA gradient and you've seen what can cause it, but that is not enough. When your patient comes to you, and they're short of breath and something is going on, you know that the AA gradient, you can use the AA gradient to figure out what is going on. But how do you compute the AA gradient? How do you calculate it? Because AA gradient, you have to be able to determine the amount of oxygen in the alveoli, right? And subtract it from the amount of oxygen, the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood, right? Well, when we do blood gas, anybody here that was an RT, respiratory therapist before? No? Okay. So, we have to do blood gas, right? When we do blood gas, we can get the arterial PO2, right? But there is no way, no how to put any instrument into anybody to go into the alveolus to go sample the air. There is no way we can do that. So we have to figure out a way to compute the alveolar PO2. And we get really, really smart here. AA gradient determination is important for clinical evaluation of low arterial oxygen level, hypoxemia, right? PaO2 is directly obtainable. Just take the artery, get a blood gas. It is impractical to sample alveolar air. So we use the alveolar gas equation to estimate the PaO2. Okay? Now, what is the alveolar gas equation? This is the alveolar gas equation. It looks complicated, it's very simple. Just take a look at it and let's walk through it. But before we go walking through it, this equation is based on some assumptions. So let's learn the assumptions. The underlying assumption, which an assumption is something that is not true, you presume it's true. You say to make things easy, you presume that that is what it is, right? The first one is we are going to assume that the inspired air contains no carbon dioxide. Why is that assumption safe, Wendy? What is the amount of carbon dioxide in this room? About 0.3%, right? Less than 1. We can ignore that. We can estimate that to be 0, right? So that's why we did that. The second assumption is that nitrogen and other gases except oxygen in the inspired air, they are in equilibrium with their dissolved states in the blood. In other words, nitrogen is not going to come from blood into the alveoli and it's not going to go into the blood from the alveoli. It will be in equilibrium. It's not going to interfere with anything. And that assumption is okay, right? The third assumption is that the carbon dioxide in the alveolar air is in equilibrium with the carbon dioxide in the arterial blood. Well, if there is increased AA gradient, that is not a good assumption, because the same barrier that is preventing oxygen from going into the blood from the alveoli is going to prevent carbon dioxide coming in the alveoli from the blood. So we have to work with it. That's the best we can do, right? So we assume that, yeah, let's make it go. Okay, so we assume that. And then the third assumption, or fourth assumption, alveolar air is saturated with water vapor from the airway. So we don't need to worry about the pressure exerted by the water vapor. Okay? And finally, the most important assumption, alveolar air obeys the Dalton's law of partial pressures. Can anybody tell me what Dalton's law of partial pressure is?
Partial pressure, or the sum.
Thank you. The sum of pressure, the pressure exerted by a mixture of gases, is equal to the sum of the partial pressure of the individual component of that mixture. So if I have a mixture of air, water vapor, and carbon dioxide in a bag, that mixture of air will exert a pressure that is going to be the sum, or the break sum, of the partial pressure of water vapor, the partial pressure of oxygen, plus the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Right? That's what Dalton said. Good. If that is true, and we assume that in our alveoli, we're going to assume that there is carbon dioxide, right? And there is air. We know that in the air there is water and there is a fraction of oxygen that is called FiO2. FiO2 is fraction of oxygen in the inspired air. FiO2, fraction of oxygen in the inspired air. What is the fraction of oxygen in room air, Miriam? 21%, right? Good. So, what is the partial pressure of water vapor in the air at sea level on a normal day? About 47 millimeters of mercury, right? So, in order for us to know what the partial pressure of oxygen is, if we can figure out what the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is, and we can figure out what the partial pressure of water vapor is in that space, we only need to subtract it from what the total pressure is, and that will give us the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveolar air. All right? Good. So here we go. Because we cannot go into the alveoli to measure oxygen, right? We also cannot go there to measure carbon dioxide, right? But we know that if we multiply or we divide carbon dioxide by the respiratory quotient, that will give us the amount of oxygen that came out in the alveoli, right? From the respiratory quotient, right? From the respiratory quotient, we cannot measure the amount of oxygen in the alveoli that is there, but we can measure, if we divide carbon dioxide by the respiratory quotient, that will give us what the amount of oxygen is that is leaving into the alveoli, right? Right? Because remember, in the alveoli there are two oxygen. There is oxygen. Yeah. In the alveoli, there is oxygen that is leaving the alveoli to go into the blood. That's what we're really interested in, right? But at the same time, I'm over explaining it and it's getting all messy. Okay. Who said it? Yeah. Okay. Let's backtrack. You all remember Dalton's law, right?
Yes.
This expression here gives us, is from here, right? If you remember this is from here. So this expression here is giving us the amount of oxygen that is leaving the alveoli into the blood, right? So we have that number, right? This expression here is the amount of pressure that is left after water vapor pressure is taken out, right? And this expression here is the percent of what is left of here that is contributed by oxygen. So in other words, let me write it down. You read, this is so important. What do you guys have after now? I might need to go over like 10 minutes. Okay. Let's say this is the alveoli, right? There is oxygen, right? There is water vapor. And we know that there is carbon dioxide. But we're going to assume that it is in equilibrium with the blood, the CO2, right? So we're going to use the carbon dioxide that we got from the blood, right? In the alveoli, there is a total pressure. That total pressure is the sum of the partial pressure of water plus the partial pressure of the oxygen we're talking about plus the PCO2, right? Now, if at sea level, what is the atmospheric pressure at sea level? 760, right? And I already told you that water vapor is generally 47, right? So you take 47 out, right? So that leaves us with 713. If I know that this is the atmospheric pressure at sea level, and I know that oxygen is only 21%, oxygen is contributing only 21% here, right? Then the partial pressure of oxygen in this air is really 21% of 713, right? Supposing I put somebody on oxygen. When you put somebody on oxygen, that is no longer room air, right? The FiO2 increases. And there's a formula for that, we'll talk about that later on. But for all purposes for now, let's talk about this. So, from this Dalton's law, I can now tell you that the atmospheric pressure minus the pressure exerted by water vapor times the FiO2, right, is going to give me the amount of oxygen in the alveolar air, right? Right? But that is not just it. Some of it, not all of it is in the alveolar air. Some of it has escaped into the blood already, right? I need to subtract what has gone into the blood. So I have to subtract this, right? Okay, you understand it now, right? I messed it up earlier. So I take normal atmospheric pressure, I remove water vapor, and I know the amount of, the fraction of the percent of oxygen in that air, in room air is 21%. That means 21% of whatever is left is the alveolar partial pressure of oxygen. But that is not all of it, because some of it is dissolved already and gone into the blood. So I have to subtract what has gone into the blood. So this is now giving me the amount of oxygen that has gone into the blood. I have to now take that and subtract it from all of this. Okay? Is it clear?
Yes.
Excellent. Sorry. What happened to my shift? Oh. I didn't say shift. I said shift. All right? So, you're good with that, right?
Yes.
So, please remember, it's all based on Dalton's law of partial pressures. This is the amount of oxygen that has left. This is the amount of oxygen that got there. All right? Good. This becomes very clear very quickly. Let's move on. Come on. Okay. The reason you told me that the atmospheric pressure is 760 because we all know we're at sea level, right? But you also know that the higher you go, right, above that sea level, you have a little bit of a problem. The atmospheric pressure decreases, so the partial pressure of oxygen decreases, right? That's why if you go, the higher you go, you live in LA, you found somebody on the internet, they live in Colorado, and you take a plane to Colorado, you're going to be sick very quickly, especially if you go mountain climbing in Colorado when you're living in LA. Okay? Because in LA, the partial pressure of oxygen is 21% of 713. In Colorado, where the atmospheric pressure could be 380, what is the partial pressure of oxygen? It's 21% of 380. That is not going to be the same, right? You're going to get sick very quickly, and people get really, really sick. That's all these high altitude illnesses. Okay?
Would you
still subtract the 47 from the 380 for that
Oh,
one?
yeah. Of course, unless there is water everywhere, right? So you will subtract the 47 from whatever the barometric pressure is, and then you multiply that with the fraction of oxygen in that inspired air. And in room air, normal air is 21%, right? Good. Excellent. Don't worry, I have this to become fun. I like this. Okay. So you're all cool with alveolar gas equation? Good. Now, let's think about it a little more. Given everything that you know now, you can understand that the airway has two major components. There are areas that function primarily as conduction zones. They just conduct the air. They don't do nothing else but conduct the air. And there are some areas that function where the respiration actually takes place, right? So you divide the air into the lung into these areas. So, minute ventilation is the amount of air that you exchange in a minute. It is usually a product of tidal volume and respiratory rate, right? It is not all the air that you breathe in and out in a minute that make it to the alveoli, right? You understand that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Only a part of it does. The part of it that makes it to the alveoli is what is called the alveolar ventilation. The part of the airway that air goes through but does not interact with blood is called dead space, because it takes up the blood and the air, but it doesn't expose it to blood. So it's a dead space because no exchange takes place. You with me? Good. So when somebody is breathing, you're not interested in the minute ventilation. You're interested in the alveolar ventilation. How much of the air they are actually exchanging is getting to the alveolus. So we have to be interested in the alveolar ventilation. How do we compute the alveolar ventilation? The inspired air is distributed between the conducting zone, the dead space, and the respiratory zones of the airway. At any given time, 2/3 of the air is usually in the respiratory zone, and 1/3 is in the dead space. Okay? Got that? Remember blood volume? 2/3 always in the venous side and 1/3 in the arterial side. The same thing here. Okay. At any given time, 2/3 of the minute ventilation is in the respiratory zone and 1/3 is in the dead zone. Not only is that true for minute ventilation, it is also true for tidal volume. 2/3 of tidal volume is in the respiratory zone and 1/3 is in the dead zone. Okay? Are you with me? Mm-hmm. Excellent. So if you want to compute, if I ask you to compute normal dead space ventilation, all you need is what is the tidal volume, what is the respiratory rate, and you divide it by 3. That is the dead space ventilation. Okay? Are you with me? And alveolar space ventilation is tidal volume times respiratory rate times 2/3. Right? And this is an example here. So this is normal tidal volume is usually about 500. Dead space is usually 150 times 12. That gives you the alveolar ventilation over there. Now the body, the respiratory control centers, they regulate alveolar ventilation. And the way they do it is by altering tidal volume and respiratory rate. So let me ask you, Fala, if the brains or the respiratory center are smart and they want to increase the alveolar ventilation, what is the most effective way to do it? Is it by increasing tidal volume or by increasing respiratory rate? Thank you. You see what happens when you double tidal volume, you get more increase than when you just double the rate, right? So that is the reason that you notice that when people are short of breath, they breathe deep and they breathe fast. Okay, so the respiratory center uses a combination of alteration in tidal volume and rate to give the alveolar good volume. Okay, this is pretty simple, right? I'm not complicating it for you, right? Everybody still with me? Excellent. So now, that is the end of respiration, ventilation, alveolar equation, and all that. You will be fine, I guarantee you. This is just, this is important. So when somebody is hypoventilating, they will have low alveolar PCO2, and they will have increase in the alveolar PCO2. They will decrease their PO2 because they're not breathing. They will increase their CO2 because they're not getting rid of carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is an acidic gas. When you hold on to carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide dissolves in water to form carbonic acid, it's an acidic gas. So you become acidotic. When you become acidotic, because you're not breathing right, it is called respiratory acidosis. Okay? Now, when somebody is hyperventilating, they will increase their alveolar PO2, but they will decrease the alveolar PCO2. And again, because carbon dioxide is an acidic gas, when you lose the acid in the body, you become alkalotic. Too much alkaline in your blood. When you become alkalotic because of hyperventilation, it is called respiratory alkalosis. Okay, we'll talk more about that. I'm just defining terms now. So let's talk a little bit about pulmonary circulation. I'm not going to waste too much time here. You already know how the blood flows. Right ventricle, pulmonary artery, comes back, pulmonary veins, left atrium, goes to the left ventricle, and goes back out. That's all there is to that. Why did I put this here? Okay, we talked about ventilation perfusion mismatch earlier, right? Let's think about it some more. So, air is lighter than blood, right? So, at my lung apex, do I have more air or more blood?
More air.
Thank you. At my lung bases, do I have more air or more blood?
More blood.
Exactly, because of gravity. So, the ventilation perfusion ratio is not uniform throughout the lungs. Okay? It ranges anywhere from 0.3 at the lung apex to 0.6 at the lung basis. That is all I'm trying to tell you here. Okay? So in other words, what I'm saying to you is there is a physiologic ventilation perfusion mismatch. Right? That is why you notice that even when it's normal, there is some air ingredient. Right? Remember, the ratio is 10 to 20, 20 to 30, and 30 to 50. Even when it's normal, there is something. Okay? Yeah.
So does that mean that like if a patient has like damage to the upper lung, it's less, how do I say, it's more, it affects the patient more if it affects his lower lung than it does the upper lung?
No, the body always balances. Because that mismatch is there all the time. Remember, the blood coming from the upper lobe and the ones coming from the lower lobe, they all mix in the left atrium. So regardless what they're coming with, in the left atrium, everything is mixed up and given to the ventricles and given out. So it does not affect them. Good thinking though. All right. How does oxygen travel? How does oxygen travel? Well, I already told you that oxygen can dissolve inside plasma, right? Physical dissolution, but that is not a good way to do it because it accounts for only 1.5% of the oxygen in the arterial blood. It is limited by the oxygen solubility, it's very poor, 0.3 mils in 100 mil. Oxygen does not dissolve well in blood. So it's only by 1.5%. The most efficient way oxygen is transported in the blood is by combination with hemoglobin. That is how 98.5% of oxygen in the arterial blood is transported. Oxygen is so efficient. 1.3 mil of oxygen binds to 1 gram of hemoglobin, and up to 20 mils of oxygen is carried in every 100 mil of blood. If you, in a 70 kg man that has hemoglobin concentration of 15 grams. And there is a weird thing that happens with oxygen and hemoglobin. When hemoglobin is sitting and no oxygen is around, it's fine. Once it attaches to the first oxygen, you start looking for more oxygen. Just like when a boy breaks his virginity. That wants all the girls, right? Right? So oxygen has that behavior, right? If he has not attached to any oxygen, hemoglobin is stable. Once it attaches to the first one, he wants more. That tendency, that increased affinity for oxygen by hemoglobin after the binding of the first oxygen is called Bohr's effect. It's somewhere. Okay, it's called Bohr's effect. Now, the reason hemoglobin could look for more oxygen after binding the first one is because he has 4 binding sites on his molecule. So once he binds one, he wants to fill all the sites. So he looks for more oxygen to fill the sites. Okay? How much interest hemoglobin has in oxygen depends on this curve called hemoglobin dissociation curve. Okay? This hemoglobin dissociation curve tells you how saturated hemoglobin is at what partial pressure of oxygen. Okay? When the affinity for oxygen is high, we describe it as decrease P50. When the affinity for oxygen is decreased, we call it increase P50. Now the question is, what the heck is P50? P50 is the partial pressure of oxygen at which hemoglobin is 50% saturated. Okay? So let's finish writing and let's think through that, because it's important for you to understand that. So, if hemoglobin has a lot of affinity for oxygen, it will bind to it at lower partial pressures, right? So the P50 will be lower. That's why lower P50 means increased affinity. If hemoglobin does not care too much about oxygen, it will not bind it until the partial pressure is significantly high. You know how some rich men try to get boys to marry their ugly daughters? By using the putting pressure on the guy, buying the guy car. Oh, you get that? I'll pay a down payment. That is increased P50. Watch that. That means the boy has low affinity. All right. So, I'm helping you remember, okay? So, that is what this is about. P50 is a measure of the affinity of oxygen. Why is this important? Because in the lungs, you want oxygen to have a lot of affinity, so it can pick up oxygen. But at the tissue level, you want oxygen, you want hemoglobin to have no affinity for oxygen, so you can let it go, so the tissues can have it. That is why you notice that decreased temperature, decreased carbon dioxide, decreased 2,3 dpg, and increased pH, which are the conditions that are right in the lungs, they decrease P50 and they increase affinity and they shift this curve to the left. Meaning that the pressure at which 50% of hemoglobin is saturated is less, is coming towards zero. Whereas in the body, the rest of the body, with increased body temperature, with increased carbon dioxide because the cells are releasing carbon dioxide, with increased D3 DPG, and I told you what D3 DPG is, and decreased pH, the curve is shifted to the right. And with that comes increased P50, which means decreased affinity. So oxygen is let go, so the body tissues can have it. So a very good question in exams is to ask you, what are the things that shifts the hemoglobin curve to the right and to the left? A very good way to remember it, remember the conditions in the lungs, and remember that lung and left start with L. So if you know that in the lungs you have low CO2, right, then you will shift it to left, right? That's something to help you remember that. Okay, moving on. We're doing really well. So, what is this? Hemoglobin saturation should be at least 90% when the arterial PCO2 is 60 millimeters of mercury. Right? You know the difference now between the partial pressure of oxygen and oxygen hemoglobin saturation, right? Hemoglobin saturation is the amount of oxygen, is the amount of hemoglobin that has oxygen attached to it. The arterial partial pressure of oxygen is partial pressure of oxygen. So I'm telling you that if your PCO2 is 60, your hemoglobin saturation should be at least 90%. 100% hemoglobin saturation requires arterial CO2 of 120 millimeters of mercury. There are some important abnormalities. At the last physical diagnostic class, you guys were using pulse oximetry, right? And you were measuring pulse rate. Were you also measuring pulse oximetry? Or hemoglobin saturation? Exactly. Did you measure hemoglobin saturation? No. You didn't. Okay, that same device does. But let's think about what are some of the situations where you have hemoglobin saturation less than 90 when you have arterial PO2 more than 60. In other words, what are the conditions that can make hemoglobin not bind oxygen in the presence of oxygen? Why won't hemoglobin bind oxygen? Well, if hemoglobin has low affinity, sickle cell disease, that hemoglobin has very low affinity. So it's possible that there will be oxygen there, but it won't bind it because it has low affinity for it. Okay? Limited hemoglobin capacity. Somebody hemoglobin is 9 or 6. Well, you can have all the partial pressure of oxygen you want. You just don't have enough hemoglobin to bind it. Okay? So you can have methemoglobin. Methemoglobin is hemoglobin that is combined to another molecule. Carboxy hemoglobin is one that is combined with carbon monoxide. Sulfur hemoglobin is one that is combined with sulfur. If somebody overdoses on sulfur drugs, these medications can bind their hemoglobin and make it unavailable to the oxygen. Okay? So these are conditions that can make you have less hemoglobin saturation in the presence of normal arterial partial pressure for oxygen. Okay? Are you all still with me? Mm-hmm. Good. Let's flip the script. What are the conditions that can make you appear to be saturating over 90 even though you are hypoxic? If you have high hemoglobin affinity, like hemoglobin F, right? You can have saturation of 90 because hemoglobin F is fetal hemoglobin. Babies grow in very hypoxic environment in their mother's womb. So their hemoglobin it can sniff out oxygen anywhere in their womb, right? And get it. Okay. So that's one situation. I give you what methemoglobin is and what carboxyhemoglobin is so you can understand a little bit more what that is. Okay? You're with me so far, right? Mm-hmm. Sally, you okay, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Now, we've talked about how oxygen gets to tissues, right? Binding, partial pressure, right? Let's talk about how carbon dioxide gets into the alveoli. How does that happen? I mean, carbon dioxide is produced at the tissue level. How does it get to the lungs?
Bicarbonate?
Huh?
Bicarbonate?
You got that right? Yep. So the first thing that happens is that carbon dioxide diffuses out of the cell into the blood at the capillary level. That's the first thing that happens. Immediately, about 7% of it dissolves in plasma. And about another 20% or so will bind to hemoglobin and it will form carbanohemoglobin. Okay? But 70% of it is converted, like David said, into bicarbonate, right? But it is not it is not like that. It's not straight. The first thing that gets formed is carbonic acid. Then carbonic acid now dissociates into bicarbonate and hydrogen ion. Hemoglobin picks up the hydrogen ion and the red cell spit out the bicarbonate. And in order for the red cell to remain electrically neutral, it picks up chloride ion. Alright? So you have chloride shifting from within blood inside the red cell. It's called chloride shift. Okay? And that's what happens at the cellular level. Once it gets back to the lungs, carbon dioxide, the bicarbonate goes back into the red cell. The chloride leaves. The hemoglobin let go of the hydrogen ion, and the hydrogen ion combines with the bicarbonate, and carbonic acid is formed again. But because there is no carbonic anhydrase this time, it's split into carbon dioxide and water. And then it comes out in the expired air. You got that? Everybody got that? You know that somehow before, right? Okay, I don't need to revise that. Good, let's go. Okay, there is this respiratory control mechanisms. I already told you, they are in the brain stem. And all these reflexes control respiration. There is Henry-Brewer's reflex is an inflection reflex. It is initiated by the pulmonary stretch receptors in response to overinflation. And what it does, it terminates inspiration. Henry Brewer. There is a deflation component that is initiated by the pulmonary stretch receptors in response to over-deflation, and again it terminates expiration. And then there are these juxtaposed, they call them J receptors. They are stretch receptors at the alveolar level, side by side with pulmonary capillaries. These ones, they respond to congestion in the pulmonary vascular bed. Okay? This one is not even understood very well how it works. But this schematic right here is a little bit of a description of how it works. The plus is what stimulates and the negative is what inhibits. Take a look at it. It's not important. Just know those reflexes, Henry Brewer and J receptors. This is important part. Respiratory control centers, they employ the most efficient combination of respiratory rate and tidal volume to minimize the work of respiration. That's what your brain does. Breathe slow in obstruction, breathe rapid and shallow in consolidation. We'll talk more about that down the road. I just need you to know about all this now. I'm at the end of my lecture. I have some questions, all right? So let's go. We go from the front row, all right? Which of the following respiratory organ is entirely passive during respiration?
The lungs.
Good. All right. Which of the following respiratory...
No, you change it. You go back. There you go.
Okay, which of the following respiratory organ is not visible on the plain chest X-ray? Larynx. Which of the following respiratory movement is essential for airflow?
Both A and B.
Good. Which of the following muscles is a primary respiratory muscle? Which of the diagnoses below best fits the flow volume loop in red on the left? Good. At which point in the respiratory cycle is the chest wall recoil equal lung recoil? End of. Pulmonary compliance is a measure of which of the following? Pulmonary compliance is a measure of which of the following? Who said all of the above? Did you say all of the above?
Those
Is all of the above? Yeah. Okay. Recoil, elastance, distance. Remember I told you that compliance and elastance are the same thing. Distensibility is my grandmother's term for compliance. It's the opposite of elastance. Pulmonary recoil is, they're all the same thing. All right? Pulmonary compliance is a measure of all of that. Okay? Which of the following factors is not a major determinant of airway resistance? Which of the following clinical maneuver is the opposite of Valsalva? Mueller. Robert Mueller. What is the estimate? Kara, this is your question. What is the estimated partial pressure of alveolar oxygen on room air in a patient at sea level at a PCO2 of 40? You did that? You did that?
It should be around, right? If it's using the equation.
Huh?
You're using the equation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it should be around. Right, minus 40.
But I want you to go through the process.
760 minus 40 times 20.
No, 760 minus 47.
Oh, 40.
That is 713, right? And then we have to divide 40 by 0.8 to take out the oxygen in the alveolar part of it. And then We now have to multiply 21% by what is left of 713. So what is it, Kara? I will write for you. No, tell me, I'll write for you. I'll write for you. What do you want to do?
So I have to do 760 minus 47.
Okay, that is 713.
That's 713. And then I have to also do 40 times 0.8, right?
So 713,
Yeah.
and then we have to do 40 divided by 8.
Divided by 8, yeah.
0.8. What is that?
32.
32. So we have to put that 32 somewhere there. And then the guy is on room A, right? So it's 21% of 713. What is that?
142.6.
142. Okay, so 142.6. Then you divide, you subtract that. So that is right. How did you figure it? It's about 100, right? You got it, right? Okay. All right.
So it should be 100, right?
Yeah, 100. Yeah, because 713, 21% is 142 something. Now you have to take out the 32. Right, we already took out the 47.
And we always divide the 45 by 8.
Yeah, to get the oxygen
That's what
volume.
coefficient.
The oxygen that is living.
Okay.
Right, okay? Excellent. You got that? You see how easy it is to apply? Understanding the Abiola equation is more complicated than its application. All right. Which of the following represent the volume of air that can be exhaled above and beyond the tidal volume? Expiratory reserve volume. Which of the following numbers represent the average respiratory quotient on a mixed diet? Good. Which of the following factors is not a determinant of arterial oxygen content? Which of the following is not? Thank you. PCO2 is not. The only reason it features in the Abiola equation is because we're using it to estimate the amount of oxygen. So just because it features in the equation does not mean it's a determinant. It's not a determinant. Okay? You got that?
Yeah.
Excellent. Which of the following factors is a cause of ventilation perfusion mismatch? Loss. Are you lost? All of the above. Good. Christian, which of the diagnoses below best fit the flow volume below? Obstructive. Good. You see, this is how you should be. At the end of class, you should be able to answer all my questions. And then when the exam comes, you just review it. That's how I like it. Otherwise, you pile up work and then you're stressed out, your hair looks like that. Which of the following activities is expected to cause a decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen?
All of them.
Are you kidding me? Mountain climbing. Decrease. Deep sea diving will decrease. That's why the oxygen nitrogen come out of your blood. Deep sea diving, right? Cross country race, that doesn't do anything. So it's mountain climbing. All right? What is the alveolar ventilation? Stanley. What is the alveolar ventilation in a 70 kg bodybuilder with a tidal volume of 600 and respiratory rate of 20?
We'll do the tidal volume times the respiratory rate. Oh,
It's up to you, I mean, seriously.
let me go back to the problem.
So yeah, I agree. So what is 20 times 600? Right? What is that? 12,000. Then what is it 1/3 or 2/3? It's 2/3, right? So what is 2/3 of that? Convert it to liters. What do you have?
8
Eh?
liters.
8 liters. Good. So, but you know how to figure it out, right? Okay. Yeah.
So if you said
But do you know that I can give you the same question and I'll give you the answers in meals? Because remember, tidal volume can also be 2/3 alveolar and 1/3 dead space. Right? So if the answer is in mil, you know you only need to use the tidal volume. If the answer is in liters, you know you have to use everything. You understand what I'm saying? Remember, I told you that minute ventilation is respiratory rate times tidal volume, right? And 2/3 of that is in the alveoli, and 1/3 is in the dead space. I said the same thing is true for tidal volume. 2/3 of tidal volume is in the alveolar ventilation, and 1/3 is in the dead space. So I'm saying that if I give you this question and the options are in meals, if the options are in meals, the answer in that case will be 400 mils, because it will be 2/3 of the tidal volume in the alveolar space and 1/3 of the tidal volume in the dead space.
No, I'm still
You
not.
write it out, yeah.
No, yeah. He's just saying, like, if it's in milliliters,
Yeah.
he might have it in liters. If it's in liters, like, or if it's in milliliters, he might just like have it in milliliters as an answer.
But how does that change? Like, you still have to multiply by two.
No, everything's still the same. It's just like the units might be different.
Remember
Don't you remember this? Didn't you see what I said? Tidal volume. 2/3 of tidal volume is in the respiratory zone, and 1/3 is in the dead space. So if I tell you somebody's tidal volume is 600, and I'm asking you what is in the alveolar space, is that not just 2/3 of 600? I'm saying that if I give you the options in liters, then I'm expecting you to use all of the information. But if I give you the options only in mils, that means I'm expecting you to use only the tidal volume to come to you. Have I passed the question?
No.
Yeah. So, in this case, you have to use all of the information. This and this divided by. But if I give you this in meals, that means I'm expecting you to use only the tidal volume. Right? You got that now?
Yeah.
All right. Kara, this is what you get for giving me trouble. Which of the following factors will shift the hemoglobin dissociation curve to the right?
All of the above.
Good. All right. Bradley. What is the estimated partial pressure of alveolar oxygen or room air in a patient on Mount Everest at 900 meters above sea level with a PCO2 of 40 millimeters of mercury and atmospheric pressure of 600? I'll write for you. Just tell me what you want. What's the first step, man?
So, what you have to do is the T is squared minus 47.
So 600 minus 47, that is what?
That's 550.
Somebody do the math.
553.
5 what?
53.
553. Good. And the guy is on room A, right? So we multiply 21%. So divide 553 by 21. What do you have?
116.13.
160. That's
116. 116. 116.
116.
Yeah.
Okay. So that is what is getting there. What is leaving? What is leaving is 40 divided by 0.8. What is that?
32.
50.
Huh? 32? What's the answer now? 160 minus 32?
So, that's 84. 116 minus 32.
116 minus 32. What is that?
It should be 50, not 32. 40 divided by 0.8.
Sorry, what is it? I'm sorry.
40 divided by 0.8 is 50. So it should be
40 divided by 0.8 is what?
50.
50?
Yeah.
Oh. Nobody told me 32.
Wait, how's 40 divided by 0.8?
Divide 40 by 0.8.
40 divided by 0.8 is what?
50.
50, right? Thank you. So what is the answer now?
66. 66.
You got, what's the answer?
66.
Good. That's all I care about. Okay, just go the answer. Don't care about it. All right. Thank you. All right. Anyone, any questions? My goodness, I didn't even need the extra time. Y'all cool with this?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Hemoglobin.
Else in there?
The way we're gonna keep this.